Keanu Reeves had always been a man of simple habits despite his world-famous name. To many people, he was the legendary actor who played roles in blockbuster films, the quiet superstar whose face was recognized in every corner of the globe. But to Keanu, he was just a regular man who liked quiet walks, warm meals, and places where nobody treated him differently. It was this same simplicity that brought him one evening to a small Chicago restaurant, tucked away on a busy street filled with the sound of cars, footsteps, and laughter. The evening was calm, with the city lights sparkling in the background. Keanu had arrived in Chicago for a short stay related to work, but unlike other celebrities who chose expensive restaurants or private dining rooms, he preferred something different. He wanted a place where the food was cooked with love, where he could sit quietly, enjoy a meal, and feel like part of everyday life. That night, he walked into a little family-owned restaurant without drawing much attention at first. He wore simple clothes, a plain jacket, jeans, and worn-out shoes. There were no sunglasses, no flashy watches, and certainly no bodyguards surrounding him. He walked in with the same calmness he carried everywhere, holding the door for a couple leaving as he stepped inside. The smell of fresh bread, grilled vegetables, and warm spices filled the air. A few customers sitting at tables noticed him but weren't fully sure if it was really him. After all, how often would one expect a global star to walk into such a modest place, all alone? Keanu gave a small nod to the waitress who greeted him and asked softly, "Table for one, please." His voice was kind and quiet, carrying no weight of fame. The waitress led him to a corner table near the window, and he thanked her with a small smile. He sat down comfortably, glancing outside at the city lights flickering against the dark sky. To anyone looking, he seemed like just another man enjoying a peaceful dinner by himself. As he picked up the menu, he didn't rush. He studied it carefully, almost as though he wanted to respect the effort behind every dish listed. Keanu had always been that way. Whether it was meeting a fan, talking to a crew member on set, or ordering food at a restaurant, he treated every interaction with sincerity. That evening, his plan was simple: to have a quiet meal and enjoy the simple beauty of the moment. The restaurant itself was small but cozy. Wooden tables with soft candles decorated the place, and laughter from a group of friends at the far side filled the air. A family with children sat nearby, their little ones giggling while trying to eat spaghetti. The atmosphere was warm, the kind that could make anyone feel at home. For Keanu, who often lived in hotel rooms and busy sets, this place felt like a small escape. The waitress returned, and Keanu politely asked for some recommendations. She suggested the restaurant's signature pasta and fresh salad. He nodded and said, "That sounds perfect, thank you." His tone carried no sign of superiority, no sense of being special. To him, she wasn't just a server, she was someone helping him have a nice evening, and he respected her role completely. As he waited for his meal, a couple at the next table whispered among themselves, finally realizing who he was. They exchanged surprised looks, amazed that Keanu Reeves was sitting just a few feet away, looking so ordinary. Yet, instead of rushing over for a picture, they simply smiled at him when he glanced in their direction. Keanu returned the smile warmly, his eyes reflecting the same kindness he was known for. The minutes passed peacefully. Keanu sat back, listening to the soft music playing in the background. He enjoyed the rare moment of normal life, something he valued more than fame or fortune. People often imagined that celebrities thrived on attention, but Keanu was the opposite. He felt most alive when nobody treated him like a star, when he could just sit quietly, eat, and enjoy being part of the world around him. The meal arrived, steaming hot and beautifully presented. Keanu thanked the waitress again, this time with genuine warmth in his voice that made her blush slightly. He picked up his fork and began eating slowly, savoring every bite. The pasta was simple but delicious, the kind of food that carried comfort in every mouthful. He closed his eyes for a brief second, appreciating the flavors, almost as though the world outside had disappeared. For the next half hour, nothing seemed unusual. Keanu enjoyed his food, occasionally sipping water, and even chuckled softly when a child nearby dropped his spoon and made a funny face. He had no need to pull out a phone or distract himself. He was fully present, appreciating the moment, as if it was a gift. But while Keanu enjoyed the peace, not everything in the restaurant was calm. The place was unusually busy that night. The kitchen was overwhelmed with orders, the waitstaff hurried back and forth, and the manager was visibly stressed, pacing around and giving instructions with sharp hand gestures. Customers were waiting longer than usual, and the air was thick with pressure for the staff. Keanu, of course, noticed this. His nature was to observe quietly, and he could sense the strain everyone was under. Still, he remained patient. He didn't call the waitress repeatedly or complain about the wait. Instead, he sat quietly, waiting his turn, fully aware that every worker there was doing their best. At another table, however, a group of customers was unhappy with their service. Their order had been delayed, and one of them raised his voice, demanding to see the manager. The manager, already carrying the weight of the evening's chaos, rushed over. His words were quick, his tone sharp, as he tried to handle the situation. But in the noise and confusion, something unexpected was about to happen, a misunderstanding that would draw Keanu directly into the storm. At that moment, Keanu remained unaware that the simple decision to dine at this modest restaurant would soon lead to a scene that would spread far beyond those four walls. For now, he was simply a man enjoying his meal in peace, carrying the quiet dignity that had defined his life for years. He had no idea that this calm evening would take a sudden turn, testing his patience, his humility, and his grace in a way that would leave everyone present with a story they would never forget. The restaurant's air grew heavier as the evening moved forward. The rush of customers had not slowed down, and the kitchen was still struggling to keep up. Plates clattered, waiters hurried from one table to another, and voices rose as some people grew impatient with the wait. Among all this noise and confusion sat Keanu Reeves, quietly finishing his salad and sipping water, not realizing that soon the peaceful atmosphere around him would completely change. At a nearby table, a group of businessmen had been waiting for their food for much longer than they expected. Their tone turned louder, their faces grew more annoyed, and they called out to the nearest server. One of them, red-faced and clearly frustrated, demanded, "Where's the manager? We've been waiting forever." The server, nervous and overwhelmed, nodded quickly and rushed toward the back to fetch the manager. The manager of the restaurant, already carrying the weight of too many responsibilities that night, walked briskly to the table. His forehead was lined with stress, and his voice carried a sharpness born from exhaustion. He tried to explain the delay, but the group of customers didn't want to listen. Their words clashed with his, and for a moment, the argument attracted the attention of other diners. Keanu looked up briefly from his plate, his calm eyes observing the scene without judgment. He had been in enough restaurants to know how hard staff worked, and he felt a quiet sympathy for the young manager trying to keep everything under control. The argument at the businessmen's table dragged on for a while, until finally the manager promised their food would arrive soon. He walked away quickly, his steps heavy with irritation, and scanned the room. His gaze fell on Keanu's corner, and for reasons even he might not have understood at the time, he assumed Keanu was part of the group that had been causing trouble. Perhaps it was because Keanu had glanced over at the noise, or because the table next to him had called out at the same moment. In his frustration, the manager jumped to a wrong conclusion. He marched over to Keanu's table with a stern look on his face. Keanu, still unaware of the misunderstanding, looked up with his usual gentle expression. Before he could say a word, the manager's voice cut through the air. "Sir, if you're going to be part of this disruption, I'll have to ask you to leave." The words landed with a shocking force, not only for Keanu but for several customers nearby who immediately recognized who he was. A soft hush fell over a few tables, and whispers began to spread like ripples across water. Keanu blinked in surprise, not offended but clearly caught off guard. His natural instinct was to stay calm. He placed his fork down gently, folded his napkin, and looked up at the manager with steady eyes. "I'm sorry," he said softly, his tone carrying no anger. "I didn't mean to cause any trouble." But the manager, already wound-tight from the chaos of the evening, misread Keanu's polite words as sarcasm. His voice rose, and frustration spilled out. "We're running a business here, not a place for people to make scenes. If you're not happy, you're free to leave." The room grew tense. Some diners gasped quietly, unable to believe what they were witnessing. They exchanged looks, wondering if the manager had any idea who he was talking to. A few tried to whisper to him, but he was too distracted, his mind consumed with the stress of too many complaints and too many delayed orders. Keanu, however, did not raise his voice. He did not argue or defend himself. He sat still for a moment, his calm face showing no sign of pride or anger. Then, with quiet dignity, he nodded slowly and replied, "All right. I'll go." The entire room watched as Keanu stood up from his chair. He didn't slam the table, didn't shout back, and didn't try to prove who he was. Instead, he reached into his pocket, pulled out some cash, and left it on the table to cover the meal he had barely touched. With a small nod of gratitude to the waitress who had served him, he turned toward the door. The sound of the door opening and closing echoed louder than usual in the hushed restaurant. For a few seconds, silence filled the room. The diners sat stunned, trying to process what had just happened. A Hollywood star, known around the world, had just been asked to leave a small Chicago restaurant like he was a troublemaker. And instead of reacting with outrage, he had walked out gracefully, leaving behind only respect in the hearts of those who had witnessed it. Whispers spread quickly. "That was Keanu Reeves," one diner said softly, his voice filled with disbelief. "The actor? The Matrix guy," another responded, her eyes wide. Soon, more people confirmed it, and a quiet storm of conversation filled the restaurant. People could not believe what they had just seen. Some customers shook their heads at the manager's behavior. "Doesn't he realize who that was?" one man muttered. Another diner added, "Even if he didn't, there was no need to talk to him like that. He wasn't causing any trouble." The waitress who had served Keanu looked close to tears, realizing that the kindest customer of the night had been treated unfairly. Outside, Keanu walked down the street, blending into the night as calmly as he had entered the restaurant earlier. He didn't pull out his phone to call anyone, didn't complain to the press, and didn't even allow the frustration to touch his expression. For him, it was just another moment in life, a misunderstanding that didn't need to be turned into a battle. He believed in peace more than pride, and his quiet steps on the Chicago sidewalk reflected that belief. Back inside the restaurant, however, the story was not over. A young diner near Keanu's table had been filming part of the scene on his phone, unable to believe what was happening in front of him. Within minutes, he uploaded the short video to social media, captioning it with disbelief, "Keanu Reeves just got kicked out of this Chicago restaurant for no reason. And he handled it like a true gentleman." That simple post would soon ignite a wave of reactions far beyond the restaurant walls. People around the world would soon see Keanu's calm reaction and the unfair way he had been treated. But for the moment, only those inside the restaurant knew what had just taken place, a shocking misunderstanding that revealed the true character of a man who never let fame or ego control his actions. As the chatter inside grew louder, the manager finally overheard the whispers. His heart sank as the realization hit him: the quiet man he had just thrown out was not a random customer. He was Keanu Reeves, one of the most admired and respected actors in the world. A sudden weight of regret settled on the manager's shoulders, heavier than all the stress of the evening combined. But by then, Keanu was already gone, walking calmly into the night, leaving behind a lesson in humility that no one present would ever forget. The night outside the restaurant was quiet compared to the storm of whispers and regret still swirling inside. Keanu Reeves walked slowly down the Chicago sidewalk, his hands tucked into the pockets of his jacket. Streetlights cast a soft glow on the pavement, and cars hummed by in the distance. Anyone passing by would have thought he was just another man heading home after dinner, unaware that a few minutes earlier, one of the most recognizable faces in the world had been shown the door of a small restaurant. For Keanu, the experience wasn't the end of the world. He had lived through harder things in his life. Fame had never shielded him from loss, pain, or disappointment, and he had learned long ago that the way one reacts to problems matters more than the problems themselves. Still, the memory of the manager's harsh words clung to him. Not because he felt insulted, but because he wished the man had known how much pressure his staff was under and how easily kindness could have changed the situation. Meanwhile, back inside, the restaurant buzzed with tension. The waitress who had served Keanu kept wringing her hands, whispering to co-workers, "He was so polite, why did that happen?" The businessmen at the other table, realizing the mistake, shifted uncomfortably in their seats. A couple of them murmured apologies to the waitress, though it wasn't her fault. Customers who had recognized Keanu exchanged disbelief, shaking their heads at the unfairness of what they'd witnessed. But the most shaken of all was the manager. He had gone back into the kitchen, his mind spinning as the words from customers echoed in his ears, "That was Keanu Reeves." The name hit him like a stone. He leaned against the counter, rubbing his temples, and muttered to himself, "What have I done?" All evening, he had been juggling stress, complaints, and endless orders, but none of that excused the way he had spoken to the quiet man in the corner. He thought back to Keanu's calm face, the way he hadn't argued, hadn't fought back, and guilt settled deep in his chest. But outside the walls of that restaurant, the story was already beginning to move. The short video posted by the young diner had started to gather attention online. Within an hour, hundreds of people had seen it. Comments poured in, "Only Keanu Reeves could get treated like that and still be so humble. This man is pure class." Any other celebrity would have yelled, "I hope the restaurant realizes who they just threw out." As the hours passed, the video spread faster. By the next morning, thousands of people had shared it. News outlets picked it up, fans reposted it with captions praising Keanu's calmness, and soon the clip was everywhere. The image of Keanu quietly folding his napkin, leaving money on the table, and walking out with dignity touched people across the world. But while the internet buzzed with admiration, Keanu himself had moved on with the same quiet grace he always carried. He returned to his hotel, ordered a simple cup of tea from room service, and sat by the window looking out at the city lights. For him, the night was just another reminder of how important it was to stay grounded, to choose peace instead of anger. He didn't check his phone for the viral clip. He didn't care to read the comments or the headlines. He simply sipped his tea and let the noise of the city fade into the background. Still, his actions left a deep mark on those who had been there. The young diner who had filmed the scene told his friends later, "You should have seen it. He didn't get angry, didn't even frown. He just walked out like it didn't matter, like he was above all of it. I've never seen someone so humble." His friends shook their heads in amazement, and the story spread from person to person, retold with awe. The restaurant staff, on the other hand, faced a very different reality. By the following day, the place's online pages were flooded with comments and reviews. People criticized the way Keanu had been treated, leaving one-star ratings and angry words directed at the manager. The waitress, who had done nothing wrong, worried about the restaurant's future. She wished she could reach out to Keanu to apologize personally, to let him know that not everyone there had agreed with what happened. The manager spent a sleepless night replaying the scene in his head. He had made countless decisions in his career, but this one moment, this one misunderstanding, had become a storm he couldn't control. The weight of guilt pressed heavily on him, and he realized that he had judged too quickly, spoken too harshly, and failed to see the truth of the situation. Keanu, meanwhile, carried on with his day as if nothing unusual had happened. He was scheduled for a meeting related to his work in Chicago, and he attended it with the same quiet professionalism as always. People around him noticed nothing different, except perhaps the way he smiled kindly at everyone he met, as though reminding himself and others that kindness was always the better choice. But the story didn't fade. With every passing hour, the video gained more attention. Journalists began writing articles about it, fans debated it on forums, and strangers shared their admiration for Keanu's response. For many, it wasn't just about a celebrity being treated unfairly. It was about the way he reacted without anger, without ego, without bitterness. In a world where pride often ruled people's actions, Keanu's humility stood out like a rare gem. The restaurant, once just a small corner spot in Chicago, now found itself at the center of global attention. Some people threatened to boycott it, while others demanded a public apology. The staff, overwhelmed by calls and messages, could hardly keep up. The manager knew he had to do something, but fear held him back. What if Keanu refused to forgive him? What if the damage was already too great? Yet, as worried as the manager was, Keanu himself wasn't angry. In fact, he told the small circle of people close to him not to take the incident too seriously. "Everyone has bad days," he said softly. Maybe he was under too much stress. "I don't want anyone attacking that place because of me." His words, as simple as they were, carried the same wisdom that had defined him through years of fame and hardship. That night, as Keanu walked once again through the streets of Chicago, he noticed how people smiled at him, whispered his name, and even waved shyly. Some wanted to approach him, to thank him for his calmness, but he kept moving quietly, his hands still tucked in his pockets. For him, the real victory wasn't the headlines or the viral video. It was knowing that he had stayed true to himself, a man who chose patience over pride, humility over anger. The misunderstanding at the restaurant had become much more than a simple incident. It had turned into a story that reminded the world that dignity didn't come from fame, wealth, or power. It came from the way a person handled themselves when treated unfairly. And Keanu, once again, had shown that true strength was not loud or forceful but quiet and graceful. The sun rose the next morning, painting Chicago in shades of orange and gold. The city woke up to its usual rhythm of honking cars, rushing footsteps, and busy conversations. But somewhere inside that rhythm, a story was quietly spreading faster than the morning news. Keanu Reeves, the quiet man with the kind smile, had been kicked out of a restaurant the night before. And the world was talking about it. By the time breakfast hours began, the video clip of Keanu leaving the restaurant had been shared thousands of times. Social media platforms were full of comments, all carrying the same tone of admiration. People were amazed not by the mistake itself, but by the way Keanu had handled it. He hadn't shouted. He hadn't argued. He hadn't used his fame to demand respect. He had simply stood up, left money for his meal, and walked out with dignity. In a world where anger often made the loudest noise, his silence had spoken the loudest of all. News outlets picked up the story quickly. Headlines appeared online: "Keanu Reeves stays humble after being asked to leave Chicago restaurant," and viral video shows Keanu's grace under pressure. Reporters praised him, fans filled comment sections with words of love, and strangers who had never followed his career before were suddenly touched by his calmness. His name was once again everywhere, not because of a movie release, but because of the way he had chosen kindness in a moment of unfairness. Meanwhile, inside the small restaurant, the atmosphere was completely different. The staff walked around with heavy faces, avoiding each other's eyes. The waitress who had served Keanu replayed the scene over and over in her mind, feeling a lump in her chest every time she remembered his gentle smile before leaving. Customers who visited that morning whispered about the story, some even taking photos of the place to post online. The restaurant, once just an ordinary spot, had become the center of a storm it never asked for. The manager, who had caused it all, sat in his office with his head in his hands. His phone buzzed constantly with messages from friends, colleagues, and even strangers who had seen the video. Some were angry, some mocking, and others simply shocked. He knew he had made a terrible mistake. In the heat of stress, he had spoken without thinking, and now the whole world knew. He thought back to Keanu's face, calm, kind, forgiving. There had been no anger there, no insult. Just quiet acceptance. The memory burned in the manager's heart, making him wish he had taken a moment to breathe before speaking. Now, the damage felt too big to fix. But outside of that restaurant, the story wasn't just about regret. It was turning into something much larger. Fans online began sharing their own stories about Keanu, times when he had stopped to sign autographs, given up his subway seat, or quietly donated to charities without announcing it. The restaurant incident became another chapter in the long book of his humility, a reminder to the world that fame hadn't changed him. People didn't just see a man who had been treated unfairly. They saw a role model. A living example of how dignity and kindness were more powerful than anger and pride. Parents began telling their children about the story, using it as a lesson. See? Even when someone treats you wrongly, you can choose to walk away with grace. Teachers discussed it in classrooms. Journalists wrote about it in columns. Keanu's quiet action had touched hearts in every corner of the globe. While the internet buzzed, Keanu continued his days as though nothing extraordinary had happened. He went to work meetings, greeted fans who approached him politely, and even took time to visit a bookstore in the city. To him, life moved forward. But he couldn't help noticing the glances people gave him, the way strangers smiled a little more warmly, as though silently thanking him for teaching them something important without using a single harsh word. Back at the restaurant, the manager finally decided he couldn't stay silent. His guilt was too heavy, and the pressure too strong. He called his staff together, his voice quieter than usual. "I made a mistake," he admitted. "I treated a good man badly. I should have handled it differently. I will apologize." His staff nodded, some with relief and others with doubt, but they knew it was the right thing to do. That evening, the manager released a public apology online. His words were filled with regret. "Last night, I acted in frustration and treated a customer unfairly. I had no idea it was Keanu Reeves, but that doesn't excuse my behavior. He was polite, calm, and undeserving of the way I spoke to him. To Mr. Reeves, I offer my sincere apology, and I ask the public not to judge my staff for my mistake." The apology spread quickly, just as the video had. Some people accepted it, some criticized it, but many hoped Keanu would respond. The world waited to see how he would react, though those who knew him already guessed the answer. Keanu didn't take long to reply. Through a quiet statement given to a local reporter, he said, "I appreciate the apology. I don't want anyone to be attacked or lose their jobs because of me. We all have hard days. I wish the restaurant well." His words were simple, but they carried a weight that silenced much of the anger. People admired him even more, touched not only by his patience but also by his forgiveness. The restaurant, once drowning in negative attention, slowly began to recover. Customers still whispered about the incident, but many also admired the way Keanu had responded. Some even came just to sit at the table where he had once been, as though it carried a special story. The staff, relieved by his forgiveness, worked with renewed effort to treat every customer with warmth and patience. Keanu himself never returned to that restaurant, but his presence lingered there like a quiet echo. His name became part of its story, and people who visited often spoke about that night as though they had witnessed a moment of history. In the days that followed, the internet slowly moved on to new stories, but the lesson remained. People remembered the way Keanu had walked out, no anger, no drama, only dignity. They remembered his forgiveness, his ability to see beyond one person's mistake. And for many, it wasn't just a story about a celebrity. It was a story about humanity. A reminder that every person has the power to choose kindness, even when treated unfairly. That simple night in a small Chicago restaurant had turned into something much bigger than anyone could have imagined. For the manager, it was a painful lesson in patience. For the staff, it was a reminder of the importance of kindness. For the world, it was proof once again that Keanu Reeves was not just a famous actor but a man whose character shone brighter than his fame. And for Keanu himself, it was just another step on the path he had always chosen, a path of humility, peace, and quiet strength. The story of Keanu Reeves and the Chicago restaurant slowly spread far beyond the walls of the little diner where it had all started. What began as a short video on a diner's phone had now become a lesson shared in homes, offices, and classrooms around the world. People couldn't stop talking about it, not because a celebrity had been treated unfairly, but because of how that celebrity had chosen to react. Keanu, as always, carried on quietly. He didn't seek attention, and he didn't want to be in the spotlight for something like this. Yet the world placed him there anyway, holding up his reaction as an example of grace and humility. For him, it was just one small moment in a life filled with challenges and choices. But for others, it was proof that kindness could still shine even in the most unexpected situations. Weeks passed, and the incident began to settle into memory, but its effect continued to grow. Journalists wrote thoughtful pieces about it, pointing out how rare it was for someone in Keanu's position to stay so calm and forgiving. They compared it to how other famous people might have reacted, demanding an apology on the spot, calling lawyers, or using their influence to embarrass the restaurant. But Keanu had done none of that. He had simply walked away. And that made all the difference. Fans shared their personal reflections online. One wrote, "I've been struggling with my temper, but after seeing how Keanu handled that night, I'm going to try to walk away more often instead of exploding." Another said, "He reminded me that being strong doesn't always mean fighting back. Sometimes it means choosing peace." The comments poured in by the thousands, each one a small echo of the larger message his actions had carried. The restaurant manager, still carrying the weight of regret, found himself deeply changed by the experience. He had faced embarrassment, criticism, and sleepless nights, but he had also been given something valuable, a chance to learn. In the weeks after his apology, he treated every customer differently. His staff noticed the shift in him. He smiled more, listened more, and no longer snapped in moments of stress. Though he wished the incident had never happened, he knew it had forced him to grow in a way nothing else could have. For the waitress, the memory of Keanu's gentle words stayed with her. Whenever she had a difficult customer after that night, she thought back to him sitting quietly in the corner, thanking her with a smile. It reminded her to treat everyone kindly, even when she felt overwhelmed. In a way, his short visit had become a guide she carried with her through her work. Keanu himself rarely spoke about the night again. If asked in interviews, he would only say something simple, like, "It was a misunderstanding. People have stressful days. It's okay." He never once criticized the restaurant or the manager. Instead, he redirected attention to forgiveness and understanding. His words reminded people that holding on to anger only weighed a person down, while letting go opened the door to peace. The lesson of that evening reached even further. Parents told their children the story as a bedtime tale, not about a movie star, but about a man who chose humility over pride. Teachers used it as an example during discussions about character and values. Motivational speakers brought it up in talks, explaining how real strength came not from how loudly one shouted but from how calmly one could walk away. And as the story continued to spread, it became part of Keanu's growing legacy. He had already been admired for his roles in movies and for the tragedies he had faced with quiet strength. But now, this small restaurant incident joined the long list of moments that defined him in the eyes of the public. He wasn't just admired as an actor, he was respected as a human being. In Chicago, the little restaurant eventually returned to its usual rhythm. The initial storm of online attention faded, but the memory never left. Tourists sometimes visited just to ask, "Is this the place where Keanu Reeves was kicked out?" Some staff members laughed, some cringed, but all of them knew the story had left its mark forever. The manager, though still embarrassed, found comfort in knowing that Keanu had forgiven him. And more importantly, he carried that forgiveness as a constant reminder to never let stress blind him again. For Keanu, the night was just another chapter in his journey, a journey marked by quiet choices that revealed who he truly was. He had faced fame, loss, loneliness, and success, yet through it all, he had held on to the same values: kindness, patience, and humility. The restaurant incident did not change him, it simply showed the world once more the man he had always been. As time passed, people often recalled the story during moments of conflict in their own lives. A worker who had been yelled at by a boss thought about Keanu's calmness and chose not to respond in anger. A teenager who had been treated unfairly by classmates remembered his humility and decided not to lash out. Bit by bit, his example influenced people in ways he would never even know. In the end, the incident wasn't just about a celebrity in a restaurant. It became something much larger, a symbol of how dignity could turn even an unfair moment into a lesson for the world. It showed that fame didn't have to create arrogance, and that kindness could shine brightest when tested by misunderstanding. Keanu Reeves didn't need to raise his voice, demand respect, or prove his worth. His actions spoke for him. He walked out of that restaurant with his head held high, leaving behind not anger, but inspiration. And in doing so, he reminded everyone watching both in person and through screens across the globe that true strength lives not in pride, but in humility. The night in Chicago was long past, but its echo remained. People would remember it not as the night Keanu Reeves was treated unfairly, but as the night he taught the world, once again, that kindness is the most powerful response of all.